Chapter 13. Jessica was in high spirits Thursday afternoon as she prepared an early dinner. For one thing, she was excited about the Wakefields' plans to hear the Messiah at the Civic Center. Ordinarily, Jessica hated classical music, but she loved Handel's Messiah. It was performed every year at this time by the Sweet Valley Choir, who dimmed the lights in the Civic Center and lit candles around them as they sung. It was so pretty that it gave Jessica chills. And it had been a Wakefield tradition for so long that it marked the real beginning of Christmas. First, they decorated the tree, an elaborate ceremony in itself, requiring a great deal of concentration and discussion. Mrs. Wakefield kept boxes of ornaments in the basement. And right after dinner, the twins would race downstairs to get them. The endless giggling and playful fighting would begin as they tried to decide where each ornament would truly look best. Stephen had taken the twins out to Jason's nursery that morning for the tree, and even though they said so every year, Jessica was positive this was the best one they'd ever had. It was almost 8 feet tall and perfectly shaped, its blue-green needles filling the house with the festive smell of spruce. It was already set up in its customary place in the corner of the living room, just waiting for decorations, and piles of presents to be stacked beneath it. But there was another reason for Jessica's good mood. 2 more reasons. Leila Fowler was back from her visit to L'Avenue, and Jessica had run into her that day when she had stopped off at the mall to pick up something for her mother. Leila looked great. She was a little thinner, and her skin was positively glowing. Jessica would have been livid if she hadn't had a revenge plan worked out. The very thought of Leila in that elf suit on Saturday made Jessica want to burst out laughing. And, on top of all that, Jessica had gotten another Secret Santa present. The best yet, as far as she was concerned. It was a menu from the second season, a new gourmet restaurant that had opened only a few weeks before. "Choose what you'd like now," Jessica read on the attached card. "This note entitles you to be my escort to this restaurant on the date of your choice, as long as the date of your choice is me. Love, your Secret Santa." Jessica couldn't believe it. An intimate dinner at the second season with Hans. She was sure now he had to be her Secret Santa. Who else? Whoever it was obviously liked her. A lot. And he also had taste. Obviously it was someone refined, someone with a lot of class. It had to be Hans. From what Jessica had heard, she had the best Secret Santa of any of her friends. Most of them were just getting the usual. A box of candy at the most, and more likely silly pranks. Like Olivia Davidson having the swim team embarrass her to death with their rendition of Silent Night. Jessica shuddered. Thank goodness no one had tried to pull that on her. The only person, she remembered grimly, whose Secret Santa even came close to hers, was Leila Fowler's. Leila, she had to admit, was doing pretty well. But for the life of her, Jessica couldn't figure out who it could be. None of the guys knew, or none of them would tell her. Anyway, so far Leila had gotten real perfume, a Vogue magazine tied up with a ribbon on her doorstep, a gorgeous poinsettia, and the latest, almost as good as Jessica's invitation to the second season, a typewritten note promising a gourmet dinner for 2 prepared by her Secret Santa. Not as good as the second season, Jessica thought, grinning. And Leila probably had someone terrible, not like Hans. Jessica hummed to herself as she opened a package of pasta. She was pleased with the dinner she was making. Red and green, she thought happily, spaghetti with tomato sauce and a big green salad. Her good mood dampened a bit when Suzanne wandered into the kitchen. "That smells good," Suzanne murmured. Jessica shrugged. "It's nothing much," she said curtly. Jessica couldn't even bear having Suzanne around since she'd overheard her on the phone with Todd. "That creep, she fumed every time she remembered it. Coming out here with her pretensions about wanting to make up, when Todd Wilkins is the only person around here she had the slightest interest in making up to. "Hey, did you make dinner?" Elizabeth asked, hurrying into the kitchen with a guilty look on her face. "Jess, I feel terrible. I've been downstairs looking at some of the ornaments. Remember the ones we made when we were in first grade? Those really horrible styrofoam angels? Mom still has them." Listening to the twins' laughter, Suzanne felt a pang of loneliness. She had made a mistake, she told herself. She didn't belong out there. She should have gone to Switzerland. Suzanne could imagine the scene at the hotel right now. Her father would be drinking a glass of scotch, and her mother would be giving him that warning look that meant, "You'd better take it easy on that stuff." They'd both be getting dressed for dinner, and getting dressed for the Devlins really meant getting dressed. A tuxedo and crisp white shirt for her father, some kind of glittery dress for her mother. Suzanne closed her eyes briefly, remembering the long line of successive Christmas Eves in hotels. It was always the same. Her parents went out somewhere, and Suzanne stayed behind. She hadn't minded very much for a long time. Every year there were other children in the same position. For the last few years in St. Moritz, the kids had made parties of their own. But now Suzanne had something with which to compare those brittle, glamorous Christmas holidays. Looking around the Wakefield's cheerful, comfortable home, Suzanne felt her eyes filling up with tears. What she would have done to have a family like this, a home like this, to have a sister of her own age who shared everything with her, to have a mother who saved the ornaments she made in first grade. "Susie," Jessica said suddenly, giving her a strange look, "wouldn't you be more comfortable in the living room? I've got to drain the spaghetti, and I don't want to burn anyone." Suzanne blinked. Jessica's message was loud and clear. "Get lost." Her turquoise eyes flashed. "Just get out of here and leave us alone." Suzanne was aware of how much Jessica hated having her around. And Jessica wasn't the only one. Whoever was sending her those stupid, cruel cards and empty presents clearly had the same message for her: go away. She would have done that if it hadn't been for Aaron's invitation. At least someone didn't want her to leave, Suzanne reminded herself, as she walked slowly into the living room and collapsed into a soft chair. Somebody cared what happened to her, and as long as that was the case, she wasn't going anywhere, no matter how clear Jessica made it that she wished she would. "Jess, that was a wonderful dinner," Mr. Wakefield said, leaning back in his chair, "and I wish we had time for second helpings. But it looks to me like we'd better get that tree decorated if we're going to make it to the Civic Center by 9 o'clock. "I'll do the dishes," Mrs. Wakefield said, getting up from the table. "Ned, you help Steve and the girls trim the tree." "Mom, we can't do it without you," Jessica wailed. She gave Suzanne a look out of the corner of her eye. "Maybe Suzanne—" "I'd be glad to do the dishes," Suzanne said weakly, feeling embarrassed. "Go ahead, Mrs. Wakefield. I'll take care of everything." Mrs. Wakefield laughed. "Absolutely not. I wouldn't hear of it. Suzanne, when was the last time you helped decorate a Christmas tree?" Suzanne blushed. "I don't think I ever have," she admitted. "Just as I suspected," Mrs. Wakefield smiled. "You go on in there with the rest of them and see what it's all about. I'll join you in about 3 minutes. Elizabeth felt a surge of affection for her family as she looked around the living room, strewn now with cardboard boxes. "Why don't we stick to just blue and silver ornaments this year?" Mr. Wakefield said hopefully, unwinding a strand of blue lights. "Daddy," Jessica groaned, "every single year you say that, and we always end up with—" Stephen and Elizabeth burst out laughing. "A family joke," Elizabeth explained to Suzanne, who had just come into the room. "My father wants to have a tree like the ones he sees in Architectural Digest, and we can't stand the thought of wasting all our colored ornaments. In the end, Daddy always loses. We say, 'Oh, let's just add the red ones,' and then the green ones, and so on. Okay, okay, Mr. Wakefield sighed. I give up. Susie, he said, come over here and give us a hand. Suzanne smiled and joined Mr. Wakefield by the tree. You see, he explained to her, these perfectly simple little blue lights are the first to go on. If it were up to me, he added with a grin, the silver balls would go next, and that would be it. But the twins... Dad, Stephen exclaimed as he unwrapped an ornament from tissue paper that had yellowed with age. I've never seen this ornament before. Do you know where we got it? A funny expression came over Mr. Wakefield's face as Stephen held up a delicate glass angel. Yes, he said softly, that was my grandmother's. I had no idea that old ornament was still around. Let's put it up this year, okay? It's beautiful, Daddy, Elizabeth said. Susie, will you put it up for us? Mr. Wakefield asked suddenly, turning to the dark-haired girl with a smile. A visible shudder went through Suzanne's upper body. No, she said quickly. I can't. I'm not. Her face turned ashen, and she grabbed into the wall behind her as if to support herself. I feel kind of dizzy, she murmured, staring down at the carpet. I'm afraid I'd drop it or something. Mr. Wakefield looked at Suzanne with sudden concern. What is it? He asked her. Tell me exactly what feels wrong. Suzanne's eyes fluttered a little as if she were trying to see straight before her, but couldn't. Elizabeth's heart began to pound. She'd never seen anyone so pale before. Daddy, Elizabeth said frantically, what can we do? Is she... But Elizabeth's words were drowned by Jessica's scream. Suzanne had lost her steadying grip on the wall, and the next thing anyone knew, she had collapsed to the floor in a heap. I'm sorry, girls, Mr. Wakefield said when he came back downstairs, nodding at his wife in a way that clearly meant something to her, though it completely mystified the twins. It looks like we're going to have to skip the Messiah this year. I know how you hate to miss it, but I don't want to leave Susie alone. What is it, Daddy? Elizabeth asked in a low voice. What's wrong with her? Mr. Wakefield looked at his wife and shook his head. She may just be tired, he said after a minute of silence. She's been under unusual stress, and she seems very wound up. Other than that... There's nothing wrong with her, Jessica was thinking crossly. Nothing but a little hysterical attention-getting. But she fainted, Elizabeth persisted, didn't she? No, Mr. Wakefield said. She didn't. She just slipped. She has... He thought for a moment, and Elizabeth was convinced he was editing what he was saying, selecting certain things to tell them and holding the rest back. She has a problem with muscular control, which is aggravated by stress. That's why she fell down, but she's fine now, he added, as if to reassure himself as much as the rest of the family. A problem with muscular control, Elizabeth thought. What did that mean? Did it have anything to do with the pills she'd been taking? Look, Dad, Stephen said suddenly, level with us. Is Suzanne sick or not? What's going on around here? Mr. Wakefield looked again at his wife. Alice, do you want to pinch hit for me? He asked her. I want to go upstairs and see how she's doing. You see, Mrs. Wakefield said when Mr. Wakefield had left the room, your father and I are really in a tough spot. We promised Suzanne we wouldn't say a word to you three, and we haven't. And, to be fair to her, we can't, even now. I'm afraid if you want to know any more, you'll have to talk to her about it. That's the way she wanted it, and that's what your father and I agreed to respect. Elizabeth bit her lip. It must be serious, she was thinking, or her mother and father wouldn't look so worried. On the other hand, she thought, maybe it wasn't. Maybe Suzanne had a psychological problem like those patients she'd read about in social studies who got hysterical illnesses. Maybe that was why Suzanne was too embarrassed to tell them about it. On the other side of the room, Jessica was reaching her own conclusion. It all sounded phony and far-fetched, she decided, studying her mother's face and deciding she was just trying to keep Suzanne from looking foolish. Obviously, Suzanne had been too embarrassed to come back here without making up some kind of story, Jessica thought. She couldn't very well tell the Wakefields that she wanted Todd Wilkins, so what she told them was that she had some kind of strange soap opera type disease, and being the sweet, loving people they were, they bought it. All Suzanne had to do was drop a few dishes and tell them she had muscular control problems. Muscular control? Frankly, Jessica could think of a few other kinds of control that girl was having problems with, and none of them had to do with dropping things or falling down. One thing Jessica was sure of, Suzanne's theatrics weren't going to fool her. No way. She knew what Suzanne was up to, and she had a feeling all of this was supposed to make Todd feel sorry for her, too. Then, when he was convinced she wasn't long for this world, Suzanne would pounce on him, and Elizabeth's heart would be broken. But I'm not going to let her get away with it, Jessica thought angrily, remembering Aaron's fake pre-party the following night. Once Suzanne realized she'd been duped, that she wasn't the only one who could fake things around there, Jessica was sure she'd go away and leave them all alone. Anyway, she wasn't worried about Suzanne. Let the rest of them worry, she thought. Jessica was sure that if anyone could take care of herself, it was Suzanne Devlin, and she didn't intend to waste a single minute worrying about her or her phony symptoms. Chapter 14. Suzanne stepped back from the mirror in Jessica's room, setting her brush down on the dresser. I wonder if I'm wearing the right thing, she said uncertainly. Suzanne was too distracted about the night's party to realize she had never looked so beautiful in her entire life. The blue velvet dress she had borrowed from Elizabeth had a high neck, edged in cream-colored lace. It was much more subdued than anything Suzanne had ever owned, almost prim, but it looked amazingly good on her. It made her look like the heroine of a Victorian novel. A simple strand of pearls at her throat completed the look. The blue fabric of the dress complemented Suzanne's enormous blue-purple eyes. Her skin was as creamy and pale as the pearls around her neck. The only makeup she needed was a little blusher, a dab of perfume on each wrist and behind her ears, and she was ready, or almost ready. Picking up the package she'd gotten on Wednesday and opening it with fumbling fingers, Suzanne slipped out the vial of medicine inside. That's strange, she said, shaking the envelope out and looking for the note Dr. Harrison always enclosed with a new prescription. That had been Suzanne's idea. She'd tried several different kinds of medication and was starting to get confused about what she could and couldn't do with each one. So she'd asked Dr. Harrison to be sure to include a list of precautions, but there was no note in the package. I'd better call him. Suzanne checked her watch. It was 7 o'clock. Aaron was coming in half an hour. Still holding the pill bottle in her hand, Suzanne dialed the doctor's office, asking the operator to charge the phone call to her parents' number in New York. Several minutes later, she was connected to Dr. Harrison's answering service. He'd already gone home. Of course he had gone home, she thought. It was 10 o'clock in New York. Suzanne studied the pill bottle carefully. Darn, she said aloud. She searched through her shoulder bag and finally found Dr. Harrison's home phone number. Again, she dialed the operator and charged the call. The phone rang 4 times. Then she heard the recorded message of an answering machine. Well, it was practically Christmas. She couldn't expect Dr. Harrison to sit around, waiting in case one of his patients wanted to check in with him. Suzanne left her message and number on his machine. I'm about to start the new medication you sent, she said, but couldn't find any precautions in the packet. Could you call me back as soon as you can, please? The luminous numbers on Jessica's clock radio said 7:10. Suzanne sighed, shook a pill out of the container, and headed for the bathroom for a glass of water. She didn't see why these pills should be any different from any of the others, she told herself. And anyway, she was all out of the last kind. Not that they were doing a lot of good anyway. Closing her eyes for a second, Suzanne popped a pill in her mouth, then took a big gulp of water to wash it down. Cheers, she thought, tipping the glass at herself in the mirror. Here's to my first victory. An honest-to-goodness invitation from someone who doesn't want me to get right on the first flight back to New York City." Turning the light out behind her, Suzanne slipped out of the bathroom and started down the steps. She could hear laughter from the living room, and she took a deep breath as she stepped down to meet Stephen and the twins. The evening she'd been looking forward to all week was finally beginning. For once, she prayed, let everything be okay. Mr. and Mrs. Wakefield had gone next door to have a glass of wine with the Beckwiths, their neighbors, promising to be back in time to say goodbye before everyone left for Bruce Patman's. Jessica couldn't believe her good luck. That meant they wouldn't be around to object when Suzanne took the car to meet Aaron. "You two look great tonight," Todd said, smiling at the twins. Elizabeth was struggling to get the cork out of a bottle of champagne the Wakefields had left for them. "Thanks," Jessica said shortly. She could hardly bear to talk to Todd, but she had to admit that he was right. Elizabeth looked terrific in a shimmery peach-colored dress with spaghetti straps, and she herself was wearing her new blouse with a pair of black satin pants. Jessica had been planning this night for ages, and she wanted everything to go perfectly, right up until midnight when the identities of the Secret Santas would be announced, and Hans would come across the room looking for her. She pictured him taking her by the hand and pulling her in his arms. "Todd," Elizabeth said, pushing the champagne bottle away, "do you think you can do any better with this?" "Mom and Dad weren't kidding when they said to be careful with the cork," Jessica laughed. "They probably rigged it so we couldn't get it open." "Here," Todd said, struggling for a minute before a terrific pop signaled that the cork was out at last. "Quick," Todd gasped as the bubbly wine began to stream over the top of the bottle. "Give me a glass, Jess." A minute later, as they were about to make a toast, Jessica said, "Wait, we're missing someone. Where's Suzanne?" "Here I am," Suzanne said, standing in the entrance to the living room. Everyone turned to stare. "Suzanne," Elizabeth gasped, "you look gorgeous." Stephen, who had come into the living room just as the champagne was being poured, let out a long, low whistle. "You look fabulous," he said softly. "Absolutely fabulous." But it was Todd's reaction that impressed Elizabeth the most. He turned a dull shade of red the minute he saw Suzanne, and the cheerful, relaxed expression on his face disappeared. He mumbled a greeting, barely meeting her gaze as Suzanne came forward. "Have some champagne, Susie," Elizabeth said, trying to cover up for Todd's rudeness. Suzanne stared at the glass Elizabeth was extending. "I probably—" "Oh, why not?" she thought, taking the glass. She was sick of having to explain things all the time. Besides, Dr. Harrison had never said she shouldn't drink. He had said to limit it to a glass or two of wine. Suzanne took a tentative sip. The champagne tasted delicious. "I propose," Stephen began, "a toast. Is everyone ready?" "Ready!" the twins cried. Todd and Suzanne looked at each other, then both looked away. "Ready," they each mumbled, obviously embarrassed. "Okay," Stephen said. "To a wonderful Christmas and a fabulous New Year, and may all of us find exactly what we're looking for, tonight and every night." "Cheers," Jessica said jubilantly, ringing her glass against his. The phone rang and everyone jumped. "I'll get it," Jessica said quickly. Elizabeth was quiet, watching Todd. The two of them had not yet gotten a chance to have the talk Elizabeth had been thinking about all week, but something in Todd's behavior, especially in the way he looked at her, made her think he knew it was over between them too. There was warmth in his gaze, yes, but no more magic. "Suzanne," Jessica called from the den, "it's for you." Suzanne carried her wine glass with her as she went to the phone. She hoped the call was from Dr. Harrison, but it was Aaron Dallas. "Susie," he said breathlessly, "is there any way you can borrow one of the Wakefield's cars?" Suzanne's heart skipped a beat. "Why?" she asked. "What's wrong?" "I've got a flat tire. The guy from the service station is looking at it right now, but it's going to take a little while." Anyway, I'm just about 5 blocks from the party, and I thought I'd walk over. Can you borrow one of the Wakefield's cars and drive over and meet me?" Suzanne looked anxious. "I'm not really that good a driver, Aaron. I'd rather—" "Susie, please," Aaron begged her. "Everyone's counting on you to come. I feel terrible, but there's no way I can come get you. I'll tell you what," he said quickly. "Let me give you directions. It's on a street called Forest Lane, and if you can come, I'll be overjoyed. Have you got a pen?" "Just a minute," Suzanne said, scrambling for one in the drawer of Mr. Wakefield's desk. "Okay," she told him. "Go ahead." "What do you think?" he asked her when he was done describing the route to Forest Lane. Suzanne thought for a minute. She took a big swallow of champagne, hoping it would relax her a little. "Aaron," she said, "let me see if I can get a car. If I can, I'll meet you at the party in 20 minutes. "Sure, you can take the Fiat," Elizabeth said a minute later. "But I'm not sure I understand. You're doing what?" Suzanne drained the rest of her glass of champagne. "I'm picking Aaron Dallas up," she said quickly, remembering what Aaron had told her about keeping his cousin's party a secret. "His car has a flat, and we'd agreed to go to Bruce's together." "Go ahead," Jessica said, smiling at Suzanne with more warmth than she'd shown all week. "You're welcome to the car, Susie." "That's kind of weird," Elizabeth said, as Suzanne went to the front closet in the foyer to get her coat. "Do you think Patsy knows that Aaron's taking Suzanne to the dance tonight? Why didn't she mention it before?" "Good night," Suzanne called, picking up the car keys and heading for the garage through the kitchen. "See you guys later." Todd looked anxious. "You're right, Liz," he said, starting to pace a little as he thought about the situation. "Something's strange about the idea, though I'm not sure—" "More champagne?" Jessica interrupted, holding out the bottle to refill Todd's glass. She, of course, didn't see anything strange about it. And if finding an empty house didn't make clear to Suzanne how little anyone wanted her around, then Suzanne was crazier than she thought. "We're home," Mrs. Wakefield called, coming through the front door. "Are you still here?" "Still here," Jessica called. Elizabeth didn't answer. She was staring at Todd, confused by his agitation over Suzanne. Just then the phone rang. "Can one of you get that?" Mr. Wakefield asked, helping his wife take her coat off. Elizabeth set her glass down on its coaster and hurried into the study. As she picked up the phone, she noticed the notepad where Suzanne had been doodling when Aaron called. 1580 Forest Lane, she had written down. I wonder what that is, Elizabeth thought. "My name is Dr. Harrison," the voice on the line said politely. "I'm trying to reach Suzanne Devlin. Is she there, please?" Elizabeth blinked. "No, I'm afraid she isn't," she told him. "In fact, she just left a few minutes ago." "Who is it, honey?" Mr. Wakefield asked, coming into the room. Elizabeth covered the mouthpiece with her hand. "Dr. Harrison," she told him. "He wants to talk to Suzanne." "I'll take it," Mr. Wakefield said, almost grabbing the receiver out of her hand. "Where is she?" he demanded a minute or two later, hurrying into the living room. "Where did Susie go?" Jessica turned pale. She borrowed the Fiat and went to pick up Aaron Dallas," she whispered, alarmed by the look on her father's face. "Why, Daddy? What's wrong?" Mr. Wakefield's glance fell on the empty champagne bottle on the coffee table. "She didn't drink any of this, did she?" he asked urgently. "A little bit," Elizabeth said, frightened. "Why, Daddy? What is it?" "That was Suzanne's doctor," Mr. Wakefield said, obviously deeply agitated. "She left a message on his machine, and he was trying to get in touch with her. She wasn't supposed to have anything to drink. She's on very strong medication, and a glass of wine could completely knock her out, maybe even kill her." The color had drained from Jessica's face. "I'll call Aaron," Elizabeth said, dashing for the phone. "What time did she leave?" Mr. Wakefield demanded, grabbing his car keys. "Daddy," Jessica moaned, tears filling her eyes. "Susie didn't go to Aaron's. It was all a lie." "What are you talking about?" Mr. Wakefield shouted. "Jessica, what in God's name is happening here? Suzanne's life may be at stake." Jessica burst into tears. "She's driving out to the haunted house on Forest Lane," she sobbed. "Aaron and I tricked her. She thinks she's driving out there to meet him, but there won't be anyone there." "Jessica, How could you do such a thing? Mr. Wakefield demanded. Never mind, he added shortly. We've got to find her. With a combination of medication and alcohol in that girl's body, she'll be lucky if she makes it there alive. Suzanne blinked and leaned forward to swipe at the dashboard with her hand. It all looked so foggy. The window must be dirty, she thought, or were her eyes blurring again? She blinked hard and tried to concentrate on the road in front of her. Let me see, she thought, trying to fight off the dizziness she was feeling. Let me see. What had Erin said she should do after Route 1? She'd written it down somewhere, but where had she left the directions? Suzanne reached into the pocket of her coat with one hand. The steering wheel was so slippery. It kept moving to the right. And she was so tired, so incredibly tired. It was harder and harder for her to make out anything beyond the dashboard. It was all just a blur of shapes. I'm falling asleep, Suzanne realized suddenly. I'm falling asleep and I can't. Jesus, the police officer in the squad car said to the officer next to him. They both stared in amazement at the red Fiat in front of them. Someone's had a little too much pre-Christmas celebration already. In shock, the two officers watched the little sports car skid dangerously to the right, straighten out again, and suddenly bump off the road, turning over on its side. The officer driving slammed on the brakes. He didn't know what condition the person at the wheel of that car had been in before, but he wasn't looking forward to seeing what condition the driver was in now. Chapter 15. Elizabeth barely remembered how they'd all gotten in her father's car so quickly. Mrs. Wakefield was staying at the house in case they needed to telephone her. Elizabeth knew she'd never forget the look on her mother's face. She was white as a sheet, her eyes wide with terror. And Todd was the one who was really scaring Elizabeth. He was trembling when they scrambled into the back seat along with Stephen, letting Jessica get in front with her father. Although he was sitting next to Elizabeth, he seemed to be oblivious to her. He stared straight ahead, clenching and unclenching his fists. I think, Mr. Wakefield said grimly, backing his car out of the garage, you'd better tell me how to get to this deserted house, Jessica. And then I'd like to hear your explanation of what is going on. Jessica, her voice quavering, told her father how to get to Forest Lane. It's all my fault, she burst out as her father cut hard in the wheel. If Suzanne's in trouble, if anything's happened to her. Why'd you do it, Jess? Todd asked savagely. Why'd you try to hurt Suzanne? Poor Suzanne, Jessica sped out, as if the words disgusted her. Poor Suzanne. She turned and glared angrily at Todd, but didn't finish her sentence. The next minute she burst into tears. Okay, Jess, okay, Mr. Wakefield said. Try not to get hysterical. I have a feeling we may all need to keep our wits about us. I just wanted to find out what happened. Why don't you start at the beginning and tell us? We don't even know where she is, Jessica wept. Oh, Daddy, I feel so horrible. Jessica, Stephen began, did this so-called party Suzanne was going to have anything to do with the other rotten things that have been happening to her? Like that letter she got telling her to go home? Or the crank phone call she got yesterday? Jessica blew her nose. I couldn't help it, she said pathetically. I thought she was deceiving all of you. I love you, and I couldn't stand seeing you made fools of, so she gulped. I was trying to protect you, and instead, you didn't answer my question, Stephen was pressing Jessica. Come on, Jess, what have you been doing to the poor girl? It wasn't just me, Jessica sniffed. It was some kids at school, too. People she hurt when she was here before. It was all supposed to be silly, she added quickly. Secret Santas in reverse, that was all. How was I supposed to know she was taking medicine, or that she couldn't drink anything? You couldn't have possibly known, Mr. Wakefield sighed, as he turned off at the exit Jessica pointed out. Your mother and I are to blame for that. Or in any case, we were involved in keeping Suzanne's illness a secret from you. That was Suzanne's doing, you understand. We wanted to let you know, but Suzanne was insistent. She wanted to try to make up with you without your pitying her. Mr. Wakefield laughed bitterly. Her parents trusted us, he said, and look what we've allowed to happen. Nobody spoke for a minute. Elizabeth was too frightened to ask her father what kind of illness Suzanne had. It hardly seemed to matter. They had reached Forest Lane, and the spotlights on her father's car picked out the desolate shapes around them. The old trees, the broken-down gates, the dead shrubs. At last they saw the turrets of the old house before them. It was dark and deserted, just as Jessica had described it. Completely deserted. There was no sign of Suzanne or the red Fiat anywhere. "Okay," Mr. Wakefield said, making a U-turn. "I think we'd better get to the first gas station we can find and call the police." "Daddy," Jessica said in a small voice, "what's wrong with Suzanne? Is she very sick?" Mr. Wakefield was quiet for a minute. "Yes, Jessica," he said reluctantly. "I'm afraid she's a very sick young lady. She has a disease called multiple sclerosis, or MS as it's sometimes called, which attacks the central nervous system." "What will happen to her?" Elizabeth asked, her mouth dry. "Isn't there a cure?" Mr. Wakefield shook his head. "No, not yet, but they're working on it. As far as what will happen, it's hard to say. Every case is different. Some people have the disease in a very mild form. Suzanne may go into remission and remain in remission for months, even years, or—" "Go on," Jessica whispered. "Or she may continue to suffer from attacks of dizziness and loss of vision. She may be less and less able to control her muscle spasms. It's possible she could be confined eventually to a wheelchair." "A wheelchair?" Elizabeth exclaimed. As hard as she tried, she couldn't imagine pretty, vivacious, independent Suzanne trapped in a wheelchair. "Liz, I'm not saying that's what will happen to Suzanne. As I said, some people have a very mild form of the disease. I can't give you the answer to what will happen in her case." Mr. Wakefield pulled into a filling station and turned off the car's motor. "At any rate," he continued, "Suzanne didn't want you to know. She was afraid you'd feel pressure to forgive her, and she wanted you to forgive her on her own, without you knowing that there was something wrong with her." The silence in the car after Mr. Wakefield jumped out to call the police was deafening. Elizabeth felt as though her ears were roaring. She couldn't believe the words her father had just spoken. Yes, she suspected Suzanne was sick, but not this kind of sickness. Multiple sclerosis. A shudder ran through Jessica. All of a sudden, flashbacks from the past week flooded her mind. The phone call they had made to New York when Elizabeth tried to convince Suzanne not to come. The horrible reception they'd given her. The moment Suzanne had dropped the crystal vase. The way she herself had pretended her blouse was missing, trying to make Suzanne think she was afraid it had been stolen. The way she had encouraged Aaron and Winston to pull rotten tricks on Suzanne. Jessica felt sick. Really sick. She was trying to imagine what it must have felt like to be Suzanne this past week. To have dragged herself all the way out there, knowing the next time she saw any of these people, it was possible that she might be in a wheelchair. A wheelchair! Admiration for Suzanne welled up in her. She wanted to tell Elizabeth and Stephen how sorry she was and how ashamed, but Jessica was afraid to say a word. Every time she turned around, Todd's face silenced her. The look in his dark eyes. Elizabeth had never seen Todd look like that before, but Jessica had. Elizabeth and Todd had been in a bad accident together. Todd had bought a motorcycle, and he and Elizabeth had ridden on it together, just once. But a drunk driver ran them off the road that night, and Elizabeth was seriously injured. She was in a coma, and the doctors were afraid she'd never regain consciousness. Todd had had the same look on his face then. He looked very frightened, as though the girl he loved was in terrible danger. Jessica knew now that she'd only had half the story about Suzanne and Todd, because Todd seemed to be in love with Suzanne. It was written all over his face, and no matter what Jessica did now to try to protect her sister, Elizabeth was going to find out. "She's in the emergency room," Mr. Wakefield said briefly, jumping back in the car. "Let's go." "What happened?" the twins demanded in unison. "Is she badly hurt?" Stephen asked. "She went off the road on Route 1 about half an hour ago, maybe 10 minutes after she left the house. A squad car was right behind her, the first piece of luck that poor girl has had in years, and they took her to the hospital in their car."
They were afraid to wait for an ambulance. She's in bad shape, Mr. Wakefield concluded grimly. They can't tell me what her chances are yet. He took a deep breath. The Fiat flipped over. Suzanne suffered some pretty bad injuries, but the car's barely scratched. He laughed a short, bitter laugh. The anger in Mr. Wakefield's laughter was the first thing Todd had responded to in almost an hour. He knew how Mr. Wakefield felt, he thought, as if fate had dealt Suzanne a horrible blow. The news of Suzanne's illness had numbed Todd so much he was barely aware of where he was. Elizabeth was next to him. He knew that, but all Todd could think of now was Suzanne. She had been on his mind just about every minute that week as it was, but now... Todd hadn't admitted to himself how much he felt for Suzanne until Mr. Wakefield had put the phone down and said she shouldn't have had anything to drink. It was funny, Todd thought, but he'd sensed she was unwell. He just hadn't wanted to admit it to himself. Nor had he wanted to admit what he was feeling when he saw Suzanne again. It was wonderful to be back in Sweet Valley, wonderful to see Elizabeth again, but it just didn't feel right between them anymore. He didn't know why, but that was how it was. And he hadn't meant to act so strangely around poor Suzanne. The truth was, she made him uncomfortable because he was so attracted to her, he thought. A lump had formed in his throat. All he wanted now was to turn the clock back. If only he had admitted to himself what he was really feeling, and if only he'd been honest with Elizabeth. He could have arranged to spend this evening with Suzanne, and Jessica's stupid trick wouldn't have worked. She'd still be sick, he knew, even if he had stepped in. He couldn't save her from that. But the car accident? Todd was convinced that was all his fault. And if she's still alive when we get to the hospital, I'm going to tell her so, he vowed. I'm going to tell her how I feel about her, and I've got to talk to Liz. Tears in his eyes, Todd inwardly willed Mr. Wakefield to hurry. He knew that even as they turned into the driveway of the Joshua Fowler Memorial Hospital, Suzanne was fighting to stay alive, and all Todd asked for now was a chance to tell her how he felt before the end. Chapter 16. Mrs. Wakefield, pale and shaken, was waiting in the lobby of the hospital when the Wakefields burst in. I already heard, she said, putting her hand on Mr. Wakefield's arm. The police called me about 20 minutes ago. Have they told you anything about her condition? Mr. Wakefield asked tersely. Shaking her head, Mrs. Wakefield led them to the left elevator bank. Dr. Ford asked us to go up to the waiting room on the second floor, she said. He's trying to get in touch with her doctor in New York. On top of everything else, it looks like she may be going through complications from the new drug he gave her. What about the Devlins? Have you called them yet? Mr. Wakefield asked. It's strange, Mrs. Wakefield said. The hotel rang their room, but there was no answer. It's about 6 a.m. there, and maybe the phone just didn't wake them up. I didn't leave a message because I thought it might scare them too much. Oh, Ned, Mrs. Wakefield moaned, steadying herself against him. If it were us, and Stephen or one of the twins was in trouble and we were so far away. I know, Mr. Wakefield murmured, stroking her hair. Believe me, Alice, I've been thinking the same thing. As they all got off the elevator, Mrs. Wakefield said, I think I should try the hotel one more time. I'll come with you, Mr. Wakefield said, putting his arm around his wife. Look, kids, do your mom and me a favor and stick together in the waiting room, okay? He asked. The last thing we need tonight is for anything else to go wrong. You can say that again, Todd muttered glumly, tracing the outline of a square of linoleum with his loafer. Poor Susie, Jessica said, tears coming to her eyes again. Do you think she'll pull through? Jessica's question hadn't been directed to anyone in particular, but Todd was the one who answered her. Why would you care? He said savagely. Unless I've missed something, Jess, it seems to me that Suzanne's accident is all your fault. Elizabeth gasped, horrified. Todd! Look, guys, Stephen said, trying to calm them all down. We're all a little tense right now, and I think—
What about you, Todd Wilkins? Jessica spat back. Don't you think you have a little explaining to do, too? Maybe Suzanne's accident is my fault, she admitted, color burning her cheeks from a mixture of guilt and rage. But what about her coming out here in the first place? Whose fault was that?
What are you talking about? Todd demanded. Jess, you aren't even making sense.
Killington, Jessica seethed. Remember that wonderful afternoon by the lodge? The color drained from Todd's face.
How did you find out about that?
What difference does that make? Jessica retorted, tears spilling over. The point is, you lured Susie out here, Todd. If it weren't for you, she would be safe in St. Moritz with her mother and father. Elizabeth felt numb. It took her several moments to realize what Jessica was accusing Todd of. Todd and Suzanne? Suddenly everything fell into place. The strange way in which Suzanne had reacted when Todd arrived on Monday, the awkward way Todd treated her, as if he was afraid to let himself be nice, the way he avoided looking at Suzanne when she was in the room, and his wild, almost crazed behavior tonight. Todd, Elizabeth said calmly, amazed by how clear her voice sounded. Did you and Suzanne meet each other again after her visit here? Before this week? Todd took a deep breath.
I wanted to tell you, Liz, but I was waiting for the right moment.
Jessica laughed hollowly. Well, she told him, this sure looks like it, doesn't it? Jess, don't, Elizabeth begged her. Her head was beginning to throb. She couldn't stand this, she thought. She was so confused. How long had something been going on between Todd and Suzanne? Why hadn't he been honest about it? Liz, Todd said beseechingly, staring deep into her eyes.
Nothing ever happened between Suzanne and me. Honest. I was skiing in Killington with a good friend of mine, and we bumped into Susie in the lodge. At first I wanted to run in the other direction.
But you resisted, Jessica said sarcastically. Jessica, stop it, Elizabeth snapped. Let Todd finish.
My friend thought she was pretty, Todd continued, looking miserable. He asked her to have a hamburger with us, and she said yes. So we spent some time together that evening, and I thought she was different somehow. Nicer. I didn't know anything about her being sick, he added, a pained expression crossing his face.
That can't be the whole story, Jessica interrupted.
I'm not through yet, Todd told her. When we dropped her off at her parents' condominium, she asked me to meet her at the lodge the next day for an hour or two. She said she wanted to talk. So I did, and she told me she wanted to apologize for being the way she was when she was out here last time. That was it, he concluded.
You mean you never told her you were coming out here to visit? Jessica asked.
Todd shook his head. Why would I have done that? It was just a nice afternoon, nothing more.
Then why didn't you mention it to me? Elizabeth asked him. Remember when I told you she was here? Why didn't you just tell me all this then?
Todd bit his lip. I don't know, he said softly. I just felt weird about it. I know I should have mentioned it, but I don't know why. I just didn't. And then I figured I'd better warn her not to mention anything either, because I thought you'd be hurt, that you'd think it was a big deal precisely because I didn't mention it.
And I thought you two had planned the whole thing, Jessica wailed. I overheard you tell Susie to keep quiet about something that happened in Killington, and I assumed—
Jess, Stephen said suddenly, is that why you've been trying to get back at Suzanne?
Jessica nodded miserably. I thought she was trying to steal Todd from Liz. I was afraid Liz's heart would be broken, so I was trying to get Suzanne to go back to New York before— Shh, Elizabeth warned. Mom and Dad are coming back. We'll have to continue this later, she was thinking, because there were still a lot of things Elizabeth wanted to find out from Todd when they were alone together.
He hadn't said anything about his feelings for Suzanne, but from the look on his face every time her name was mentioned, Elizabeth felt almost certain that Jessica wasn't entirely wrong about Todd and Suzanne. Todd clearly felt something for her, Elizabeth realized now. But this was not the time to think about it. At the moment, no one could tell whether poor Suzanne would be strong enough to live through the night. "We got through to the Devlins," Mrs. Wakefield said, taking a seat next to the twins in the waiting room. "Those poor people. They're hysterical. God only knows what they must be feeling right now. They're going to do everything they can to fly out immediately." "And we reached Suzanne's doctor in New York, too," Mr. Wakefield added. "He seems like a wonderful man. He'll be here on the first flight he can get." "Have you heard any more about Susie?" Jessica asked fearfully. "We were about to ask you that," Mrs. Wakefield sighed. "No, Mr. Wakefield?" a snowy-haired, kind-faced doctor inquired, swinging open the door to the waiting room and checking something on the clipboard in his hand. "Are you Mr. Wakefield?" he asked, reaching out his hand. Mr. Wakefield shook it warmly. "You must be Dr. Ford," he said. "How is she?" Elizabeth felt the tension as everyone silently waited for Dr. Ford to speak. Jessica was staring at the doctor's face, transfixed, as if she could will him to say something positive. Stephen and Mrs. Wakefield were as white as paper. And Todd? As long as she lived, Elizabeth thought miserably. She hoped she would never again have to see an expression like Todd's just then. All the anxiety, the misery, and the love were so plainly written on his face, it hurt even to look at him. "Well," Dr. Ford said, looking around at the stricken faces, "Suzanne is one lucky young lady. She's in stable condition. Frankly, considering the combination of alcohol and pills and the car accident, I think it's a miracle. But she escaped with only minor cuts and bruises and a slight concussion." The cries of excitement and jubilation that broke out almost knocked Dr. Ford off his feet. "She's going to live!" Jessica screamed, throwing her arms around her mother. "Hooray!" Stephen hollered, picking Elizabeth up in the air. "What can we do now?" Mrs. Wakefield asked. "I would suggest," the doctor replied, "going home and getting a good night's sleep. That's what Suzanne will be doing, and right now there is nothing better for her than rest. Rest and time. Tomorrow morning, when Dr. Harrison is here, we'll start a complete round of tests." Elizabeth felt almost dizzy with relief as she listened to the excited talk around her, but with the relief came a feeling of enormous confusion. From Todd's attitude toward Suzanne, she knew that he cared about her a great deal, perhaps more than he was willing to acknowledge. She herself felt surprised and a little hurt, but not as devastated as she would have been several months ago. She just knew that she and Todd had a great deal yet to sort out. And now that Suzanne was out of danger, Elizabeth wanted a chance to see Todd alone, to find out exactly where, if anywhere, they stood. "It's only 11:15, Jessica pointed out when they had all piled into Mr. Wakefield's car. "We can still make it over to Bruce's if we hurry." "Jess," Elizabeth groaned, "don't you think—" "I want to go," Jessica said stubbornly. "I want to find out who my secret Santa is." "We could help Suzanne out if we went," Stephen said thoughtfully. "How's that?" Mr. Wakefield asked. "Well, a lot of people around here still have the wrong idea about her," Stephen said. "If we drop by the Patmans, we can spread the word about what happened and how rotten we feel about treating her the way we have." "Steve's absolutely right," Jessica said, the pout on her face disappearing. "We have to go. It would be wonderful," she added, "if we could round up some kids to go over and visit her tomorrow. And—" "Jess," Mr. Wakefield said, "no plans. I'll be happy to drop you kids off at the Patmans, and you're welcome to say whatever you please about Suzanne. But no one, I repeat, no one, is to make a single plan concerning that poor girl. She needs rest now, not one of your schemes." "What are we going to do about the Fiat?" Jessica asked, suddenly remembering the car. "Where is it?" "Jackson's Foreign Cars," her father told her. "The police had it towed there. I'm afraid you kids will have to find some other way home. Can you get rides?" I'm sure we can, Jessica said blithely. Elizabeth wasn't enthused about going to Bruce's, but she knew that Jessica and Stephen were right about one thing. If they went, they could tell everyone what happened. It would mean the world to Suzanne if people forgave her. And even knowing how Todd felt, Elizabeth couldn't hold anything against Suzanne. She deserved some happiness. Real happiness. If Todd cared for Suzanne, Elizabeth thought, sighing deeply, she deserved Todd. And that's the very best way I can think of showing her that I think she's a wonderful person, someone I'd like to have as my friend. By the time the Wakefields and Todd arrived at the Patmans' mansion, the Christmas dance was in full swing. They could see candles shining in the ballroom on the second floor. Bruce opened the door in their second ring. "Jess, Liz," he cried, "where have you been? We've all been frantic. Hi, Todd," he cried warmly, slapping him on the shoulder. "Hi, Steve. Merry Christmas." 5 minutes later, they were upstairs in the ballroom, looking around with amazement. "It's like being inside a Christmas tree," Elizabeth whispered. Suddenly she was glad they'd come. The room was entirely lit by candles, some gleaming in a chandelier, and others on the tables that lined the room. At one end of the room stood the biggest tree she'd ever seen, gleaming with silver balls and blue lights. Just like an architectural digest, she thought, smiling. Daddy would be happy. The Patmans had hired a live band who were playing on a dais in one corner, and the dance floor was crowded with students from Sweet Valley High. Todd, Elizabeth, Jessica, and Stephen were spotted as soon as they came in. Instantly they found themselves surrounded by friends, all wanting to know what happened. "I'll tell you," Jessica said with a sigh, "since it was mostly my fault." And taking a deep breath, she launched into the whole story. Everything except the most important point of all. She didn't say a word about Suzanne and Todd. "She's all right, your sister," Todd said a little later. He and Elizabeth were alone in the corner, listening to the music and sipping Christmas punch. "I'm sorry I blew up at her earlier. I was scared and didn't know how else to act." "Todd," Elizabeth began. "Let me go first," Todd said. "Liz, I can't tell you how awful I feel about everything that happened tonight. I can't imagine how hurt you must be. If you only knew how much I care for you, how much I'll always care." "Todd," Elizabeth smiled, "I could let you go on feeling guilty. But the truth is, I was getting ready to tell you that I thought we really weren't right for each other anymore. Not as girlfriend and boyfriend. I felt it all week. I love you," she added, "but I know that what we had is changing now into something else." Todd's eyes shone with tears. "Liz," he said, "you are the most wonderful friend I've ever had." "What you have to decide," Elizabeth said slowly, "is how you feel about Suzanne, and whether your feelings are affected by what you learned tonight about her health." Todd shook his head. "It feels so strange talking about another girl to you." "I know," Elizabeth admitted. "I have to say I was a little stunned when Jessica dropped her bombshell tonight. For an hour or two there, I felt upset about it all. It's one thing," she said truthfully, "to have been having doubts about our relationship. But you and Suzanne," she shook her head. "The thing is, I've never really been the jealous type. You know that, and I want you to be happy, Todd. Really happy." "You're a pretty special person," Todd said huskily. "Liz, will you promise me something?" "Sure," Elizabeth said. "What is it?" "Wherever I am, wherever I go, can I always count on you to be my very best friend?" Elizabeth smiled at him. The lump in her throat had entirely melted. "Of course you can," she said. "Though, to be truthful, I know after a while, after you fall in love again, I may be edged out." "Not on your life," Todd whispered. His eyes filled with tears as the band began playing the song he and Elizabeth had always considered theirs. "How about a dance?" he suggested, "for old time's sake." "I'd love to," Elizabeth said warmly. And as Todd put his arms around her, she realized that she was okay, really and truly okay. It was practically Christmas Eve, and Suzanne was alive, and Elizabeth had her family and friends who loved her, and she was dancing to a beautiful song with her best friend in the world. Jessica couldn't believe it. Winston Egbert? Winston was her secret Santa. The class clown had been the one sending her flowers, inviting her to the second season. Even worse was watching Hans lead Leela Fowler out onto the floor. It just wasn't fair, Jessica thought miserably. Of all the rotten luck. That meant, she reminded herself, that Leela would get a wonderful meal with Hans. And since Hans was living with a family, they would probably have the dinner at the Fowlers. No one else would be there. Leela would dim the lights, and all be at the second season with good old Winston Egbert. She had to force herself to look interested when the other Secret Santa pairs were revealed. She danced with Bruce, who claimed the gifts she'd left for him were just wonderful, though Jessica was afraid they'd really been on the dull side. Bill Chase, it turned out, was Olivia Davidson's Secret Santa. It was his idea to have the swim team serenade her. Remembering that night at the Dairy Burger, Jessica was suddenly seized by an inspiration. Bruce was making a speech on the days over a microphone, and Jessica waited until he was done before hurrying over to whisper in Mr. Collins's ear. He gave her a big smile and picked the mic up. "I know how much fun Secret Santa Week has been," he told the crowd, "and it's partly because of that I want to ask you all to think about someone who didn't have a Secret Santa." Mr. Collins went on to tell the entire crowd what had happened to Suzanne. "She's in the hospital," he concluded, "and I bet she'd sure appreciate it if a few of you decided you wanted to play Santa for her for the next day or two." Mr. Collins's words were met with applause. "Jessica," Elizabeth hissed, "didn't Dad say—" "This isn't a scheme," Jessica said innocently. "It's just a suggestion." Elizabeth smiled at her twin. "Merry Christmas, Jess," she whispered. Jessica engulfed her twin in a bear hug. "Merry Christmas, Liz," she sang out. "You know," Elizabeth said, linking arms with her sister as they looked around them to see whom they could ask for a ride home, "it's had some strange parts, but this Christmas hasn't really been that bad so far." "No," Jessica agreed, trying not to meet Winston's eye as he hurried toward them, car keys jangling in his hand. "It hasn't been bad at all." "Ladies," Winston said with a mock bow, "rumor has it you are in distress and need a ride home. Could you possibly allow me?" "You never know," Jessica whispered. "We've still got a while to New Year's, Liz, and it looks like it could get worse. Fast." But Jessica was just kidding, and Elizabeth, hurrying over to tell Todd they had a ride, suddenly felt light as a feather. It was going to be a wonderful Christmas, she thought happily, and the beginning, she was almost positive, of the very best year yet. Chapter 17. Elizabeth gasped. "I can't believe it! She did it, Todd! She really did it!" It was Saturday afternoon, and Elizabeth, Todd, Enid, and several other classmates were watching the Christmas parade. Elizabeth couldn't believe that Jessica could really stick Leela with being an elf. But somehow she had, because there was Jessica wearing the silver crown and waving on the very first float. And 4 floats back, a very grumpy-looking Leela Fowler was helping Santa pass out presents to the spectators. Leela was wearing a green trash bag just like the one Jessica had worn, and her face was covered with green paint. "She looks like a giant pea," Enid said, giggling. Elizabeth laughed. It felt so good to have things back to normal. Or more or less back to normal, she reminded herself. Suzanne had made good progress overnight, according to Dr. Ford, but now that Dr. Harrison was in town, they were doing extensive tests to determine whether or not the new medication and the concussion had worsened her condition. "You must feel pretty anxious," Elizabeth said to Todd. "I do," he admitted, squinting at Santa's float. "I can't help wondering what's going to happen to Suzanne. You know, Liz," he added, "I have to admit that I don't even really know how she feels about me. Maybe—" "Todd," Elizabeth said gently, "you'll just have to take your chances. Tell her how you feel." Todd would be okay, she thought, and she had a strong feeling that he and Suzanne would work things out. As for herself, Elizabeth couldn't help feeling a twinge of excitement, wondering what the new year would hold in store for her. A tall, handsome stranger, she wondered. amused at how much like her twin she sounded. In any case, she had no doubts about the breakup with Todd. They'd had a wonderful relationship, and Elizabeth knew she'd never forget him, but it was time for both of them to move on. Deep inside, Elizabeth found herself looking forward to finding out what was waiting for her around the next corner. Maybe it would be a while before she found someone wonderful again, but Elizabeth knew that only time could take care of that for her. Just then, the future looked bright indeed. "I don't know, Jess," Elizabeth said critically, wrinkling her nose as she surveyed the enlarged photograph from all sides. Jessica had propped it up against her bed for a viewing session before wrapping it. "What do you mean you don't know?" Jessica demanded, looking injured. "Can you tell me what in the world would make a better present for Mom and Dad?" Actually, the photo had come out well. She and Jessica had linked arms, and their faces were turned slightly toward each other. "It's kind of scary how much alike we look," Elizabeth added. "It's your luck," Jessica said sweetly, "to have a duplicate copy of this face." She dissolved into giggles. "Thank God Susie's all right," she added a minute later, turning serious. "Liz, do you think she'll ever forgive me?" "How could she help it?" Elizabeth sighed. "Hard as I try to stay mad at you, I always back down." "What about Todd?" Jessica asked quietly. "Are you feeling okay about what's happening?" Elizabeth nodded. "Todd and I have been far away from each other for a long time. Things were bound to change, and I just feel lucky that we'll still be friends. Honestly, Jess, I've sensed things were changing between us. So, yes, I feel okay. Better than okay." The telephone rang, and Elizabeth leaned over to grab it. "It's Leila Fowler," Elizabeth said, covering the receiver with her hand, "and she sounds like she's having fits. Do you want to talk to her, or should I tell her you've moved to Mars?" "I'd better talk to her," Jessica sighed, and reached for the phone. "It's now or never." Leila was one person, she had a feeling, who was not going to find it hard to stay angry with her. But every time she remembered how foolish Leila had looked in the elf suit, she wanted to crack up all over again. It was worth it, Jessica decided. However angry Leila was, it was definitely worth it. By the time the twins got to room 312, it was almost 7 o'clock, and they exchanged uneasy glances as they approached Suzanne's room, wondering what they'd find when they finally reached her side. Elizabeth gasped when Jessica opened the door. The hospital room was crammed full of flowers and presents. One entire windowsill was lined with cards, and a baby spruce tree, fully decorated, had been set up in the corner of the room. Suzanne was sitting up in bed, her black hair flowing over her shoulders. She looked pale, but more beautiful and radiant than ever before. And she was staring at Todd, who was sitting on the edge of her bed, holding her small hand tightly in his own. "Excuse us," Jessica said, looking nervously at her twin to gauge her reaction. "Susie," Elizabeth said warmly, hurrying over to the bed so they would see at once she didn't mind. "I'm so glad you're all right." Suzanne blushed and dropped Todd's hand. "I'm more than okay, thanks to you two," she said. "You wouldn't believe this place. It's been like Grand Central Station in here. Bruce Patman brought the tree, and Winston and Aaron were here an hour ago. Winston brought me some crazy games, and Aaron invited me to have lunch with him." "Susie," Elizabeth began, shooting a look at Jessica, "I owe you an apology. I had no business treating you the way I did. If I've learned anything this week, it's that everyone deserves a second chance." "I'm the one who really ought to apologize," Jessica chimed in. "Susie, do you think you can forgive me for the horrible trick I pulled on you last night?" "If you can forgive me," Suzanne said gravely, "then I'll be the happiest person in the world." "That's all I want," she protested. "Jess, I don't blame you one little bit." Suzanne turned to Elizabeth. "Todd has explained a great deal to me, and I understand now why Jess did what she did. But the way I acted the first time I came out here, I really didn't have an excuse. That's why I need to beg you," she hung her head, "to forgive me anyway." The next minutes both twins were on the bed, hugging Suzanne and crying. "What's going on in here?" Stephen demanded, opening the door. "Never mind," he added, as if something had just occurred to him. "Tell me later. Mom, Dad, and 2 doctors are on their way in here, so you guys better look normal."
At once the twins bounced off the bed, dragging Todd with them. Stephen was right. The door opened a moment later. Elizabeth knew something was up the minute she saw her mother's face. It was shining with joy.
"Suzanne," Dr. Ford said, "I hate to put you through a long medical talk, so I'm going to let Dr. Harrison take over for me and tell you himself what we found out today. But I think," his blue eyes twinkled, "that you'll agree with me that it's about the best Christmas present we could have hoped to give you."
Dr. Harrison, a spry, gray-haired man in his early 60s, came over and sat down on the bed where Todd had been a minute ago.
"Susie," he began, "remember when you first started coming in for tests and I asked you if you'd had a virus lately?"
Suzanne nodded. "I hadn't," she said. "That's why—"
Dr. Harrison held up his hand. "You did," he told her ruefully, "and that's where all the mistakes began."
"Mistakes," Suzanne said.
"But you had a very common virus, mononucleosis," Dr. Harrison told her, "only it was an undetected case. Remember you complained of feeling tired and headachy for a month or 2?
Suzanne nodded. "Yes, but I still don't understand."
"Susie," Dr. Harrison burst out, "you don't have multiple sclerosis at all. We've been racking our brains all day, and we finally figured out what happened. You see, you had an undetected virus and several months later began to experience a very rare complication from it."
Suzanne was staring at him, hanging onto his every word. "Go on," she whispered.
"This complication is an infection of the central nervous system," Dr. Harrison continued, "resulting in dizziness, blurring, and occasional loss of muscle control. Suzanne, you never had MS. I've been treating you for a disease that you don't have."
Suzanne burst into tears. "You mean," she said brokenly, clutching into the doctor's arm, "you mean I'm normal? Like everyone else?" Elizabeth felt a lump forming in her throat. She felt as though she were seeing a miracle take place in front of her. Across the room, she saw the look on Todd's face and guessed what he was feeling. "It's a new beginning for us all," Elizabeth thought. "A new chance for all of us to find—" What were the words her brother had said when he was making his toast the night before? "What we all want tonight and every night," Elizabeth thought. The next thing anyone knew, the door to Susie's room burst open.
"Suzanne!" Mr. Devlin cried, rushing across the room to take his daughter in his arms.
Mrs. Devlin was right behind him.
I'm afraid I don't know who these people are," she said, gesturing toward the door.
"Liz!" Jessica gasped, clutching her arm. It was the entire swim team, plus some of their friends, this time clad in shorts and T-shirts that were decorated with green letters. When the boys had fanned themselves out as best they could in the crowded room, the letters spelled, "Merry Christmas, Susie." And the next thing Elizabeth knew, Bill Chase had sounded a note on his harmonica, and the whole group burst into the first line of Silent Night. Elizabeth didn't know whether she wanted to laugh or cry. The swimmers looked insane with their arms around each other, but there was something warm and touching about their singing. She could tell how happy Suzanne was, too. She looked as if she was about to burst with joy. "Merry Christmas, Liz," she heard Jessica whisper again. But Elizabeth's heart was too full to answer. It certainly was, she thought happily. Everyone was together, safe and healthy and glad. Christmas had arrived at last.